The roster of successful Aaron Baperos didn't change much between 1965 and 1980. Tomei had been replaced by his brother Dino, and some new fortunes were being made in tourist-oriented businesses. Still, the surest predictor of success in 1980 was success in 1973, even as far back as 1965. Most of the 1980 boat owners had owned vessels for more than a decade. The conversion of ranked hierarchy into a stratified hierarchy happened like this. People who had worked hard and innovated intelligently during the 1960s had acquired productive property. They were good risk for loans during the early 1970s and were able to motorize. Motorboats cost much more than sailboats, and reflecting the higher price and operating costs, owners took a larger share of fishing profits to compensate for their greater investment. The differential between boat costs and fishermen's earnings never stopped growing. As capital, initial wealth had been a factor in continued success, the new fishing patterns accentuated the value of a new input, time, to devote to a series of new land-based concerns. Dino's decision to retire from fishing to work on the land side of the fishing business was critical in his success for several reasons. First, the new pattern demanded that all fishermen, including the captain owner, spend 3 to 4 days per week at sea. This left just one workday, Monday, to attend to land-based concerns of the fishing business. One day wasn't enough. Aaron Bepe's fishing industry had relinquished the autonomy that wind power, locally manufactured supplies, low consumer demands, and production for immediate consumption had permitted. Like 1,000 other third world communities, Aaron Bepe's lifestyle was becoming more like our own, as villagers gave up more and more of their self-sufficiency. The whole fishing operation now depended on external supplies. For example, each fishing expedition required 30 sacks of ice at a total cost of $35. Crews had to await ice trucks from Salvador, which often arrived behind schedule, forcing delays in fishing. Much of the bait used in 1980 was shrimp from faraway Sao Paulo. Villagers no longer relied on casting for schools of tiny bait fish in the harbor. Local casting experts and net makers had let their skills lapse, and no youngsters had replaced them. Shopping for a new boat or motor might require several trips to Salvador. Borrowing money from the banks or through government programs was also time-consuming. If one wished to market his own fish, he had to supervise weighing, keeping records, arrange transport to Atapoan, and maintain relations with the fish stores there. 100 other minor matters filled a boat owner's time in 1980. Tomei complained that as owner and marketer for 2 boats and captain of one, he never had enough rest. We see then that the increased demands on the land subverted the once common dual role of captain-owner, nor in economic terms were an owner's efforts as captain particularly cost-effective. Assuming the same 200-kilogram catch previously used for calculation, the owner, by employing a captain, would have cut his gross profits by just 17%. Still, the value of the dual role of captain-owner had never been simply economic but also social. Owners who were also captains, who shared daily fellowship, fatigue, and dangers with ordinary fishermen, had traditionally commanded greater crew allegiance than non-fishing owners did. The matter wasn't nearly as simple in 1980. The special expertise of the captain was less valuable, since crews fished in strange waters, and since almost all of the fishing was now done over the slope. There was little landmarking of the sort that was once believed to separate captains from ordinary crew members. Also, the differential rewards of owner and crew had become much too obvious to mask behind any captain's ordinary fellow behavior. How could strain be absent when everyone knew that fishing owners got 10 times the ordinary fisherman's share for the same day's work, and when even captains made twice as much? Another change in the relations of the production was that fishermen no longer had set places. Because of the loyalty of crew members to captain and owner had diminished, there was more shifting. Its extent reflected fishing strategy, with the greatest crew fluctuation on short-term expeditions. I saw several crews assembled on the spot for daytime or overnight fishing. Long-distance fishing had more stable crews. Owners and fishermen counted on a 4-day work week. The owners had to make larger investments in perishable ice, bait, food, and therefore needed to ensure that fishing would take place. One way of keeping the crew loyalty was to give cash advances. This indebtedness had become a new way for owners to keep their crews. This provides one more example of the ongoing and pervasive shift from social to economic relations of the production. That is, by 1980, many men fished for someone, not because he was a relative friend or compadre, but because they owed him money. Given these changes, fishermen were fascinated by television reports about a fishermen's strike in southern France going on during my 1980 visit. We have grievances too, fishermen told me. For example, the price of fish hasn't risen fast enough. Although sympathetic to the French strike, Aaron Beperos couldn't understand how those fishermen could afford to stop working. They must have some kind of insurance, one villager surmised. In Aaron Beppe, there's no such thing. Another grievance was living conditions during long-distance fishing. Grown men have to try to sleep in crowded quarters alongside a noisy motor, and the cabins hold only 3 men, so the other 1 or 2 have to sit outside. Sometimes it's cold, especially when there's a wind. Fishermen also face the danger of sudden storms in distant waters. Although owners didn't directly share this risk, they did fear the loss of their investments. In August of 1980, coinciding with the unusually high and low tides that accompany a full moon, Aaron Beppe had an unseasonable storm, one of the worst I had ever seen there. Most of the boats had returned by the evening of August 29th, but a few were still out. The churning waves brought Tiber's residues close to the shore. The ocean was yellow and strong, making entrance to the harbor very dangerous. On a day like this, one fisherman said, the cold at sea slaps you in the face. There are people out there, remarked Alberto, thinking they're going to die if their motor fails. Alberto's nephew stood for hours on Alberto's porch trying to sight his boat, which he had allowed an inexperienced captain to take out for the first time. The young man had just borrowed money from a bank in Salvador for a new motor. He barely begun to make the payments, and now lacking insurance, like all Aaron Bemperos, he faced loss of his means of livelihood. The boat eventually arrived unharmed. The shift in Aaron Beppe's fishing industry from social to economic relations, detectable in 1973, had proceeded rapidly. From start to finish, fishing had become a business in which an owner, usually not a fisherman, expropriated more than half the labor product of the fishermen. No longer independent producers, fishermen had become employees. They resented captains and owners and lacked trust in each other. Unlike 1973, when a few crews still used the joint line system, every fisherman now marked his catch individually. Each crew member had his mark, cutting one side of the tail, both sides, the head, or the area below the throat once or twice. It was rumored that some fishermen stole from others by adding a second cut to the neck or an extra slash in the tail, if it was their mark. Concern with the individual share continued on land as fish were weighed separately. Division and weighing of the catch had moved inside from public space, the beach, to private space, the shacks and fish stores owned by land-based entrepreneurs. With boats coming and going at different times, the daily public ritual of the 1960s had ended. No longer did the village assemble to greet the boats as they returned in the late afternoon and watch the fishermen pool their catches, deciding on how much would be sold, how much would be kept for their families, and how much would be given away to destitute onlookers. The village poor still begged, but often now they were cursed or ignored altogether, and they rarely got pieces of fish. I was told repeatedly that most of Aaron Beppe's 1980 fishermen were immigrants, people from the northern coastal village of Suape in particular. As noted, Suape lacks a good harbor, and its only fishing vessels are small rafts. As Aaron Beppe's fishing expanded to include the slope offshore from Suape, the northerners began moving to Aaron Beppe to catch more fish and make more money than before, riding boats from Aaron Beppe to their own fishing grounds. Further from a city than Aaron Beppe, Suape's traditional fishing economy had been less cash-oriented. Suaperos were willing to work for less than Aaron Beperos were, because their cash income still exceeded what they could make back home. The new relation of production could continue only as long as immigrants kept on arriving and accepting low wages. One thing hadn't changed. Boat owners couldn't profit from fishing without fishermen, and Aaron Beperos were, as any villager would agree, deserting fishing for other jobs. The number of native fishermen in 1980, 57, had fallen to less than half of the 1964 figure. Many villagers said the trend was for fishermen to go to work for Tibris, but statistics didn't bear them out. Data on the 1980 occupation of the 105 fishermen who had lived in Aaron Beppe in 1973 are tabulated in Appendix 4. Only 8 of these had shifted to Tibris jobs by 1980. To be sure, one aspect of Aaron Beppe's economic transformation was that more native sons, although not more ex-fishermen, were doing factory work, 17% in 1980 versus 11% in 1973 and 2% in 1964. Of the 40 Aaron Beperos employed by Tibris in 1980, 80% were natives. This differed sharply from fishing, where just 63% were natives. Most of the Tivas workers were younger than 30. Some of them, of course, would have fished in the old economy, but many would have sought jobs other than fishing in Arambiparo or outside. Tivas workers are less likely than fishermen to have a family background of fishing. The dramatic shift from social to economic relations in fishing can now be seen in a larger context that includes Arambepe's general economic transformation, increased immigration, and growing heterogeneity. Gone with the Wind was the socially cohesive, kin-based crew of the 1960s. Only 4 1980 crews had close kin ties, compared with over 20 in the 1960s. In factories, construction, business, and tourism, co-villagers who would in the past have labored alongside one another in a fishing boat were now working separately in varied locales. Crews were relying more and more on recent immigrants with weak local social links. Nor did immigrants have much time to forge such ties, since they spent 4 days each week at sea. The immigrants remained strangers, emerging from their usual isolation to partake in weekend drinking. The outsiders, in turn, resented other villagers, particularly non-fishing natives who exploited their labor. Distrust pervaded social relations in crew and village alike. Related to these changes, the Fishermen's Society had declined in importance. It had fewer meetings, and the candidates for president in 1980 were both non-fishermen. Boats no longer gave as units. Each fisherman was supposed to give 200 cruzeros, less than $5, for the annual Festa of St. Francis in February. Villagers lamented that the festival had become an affair mainly for tourists. The Festa used to be the fishermen's thing. Now it's for outsiders. Business people now played a major role in society and in organizing the festival, and of course they reaped far larger profits. Thus, by 1980, the increased cost of industrial technology, along with cupidity, had bloated the owner's share of fishing profits. More productive fishing had also raised profits. The annual catch of the average boat had risen from 3,500 kilograms in 1965 to 5,500 kilograms in 73 and 9,000 kilograms in 1980, through long-distance fishing. In 1965, the cost of a fully equipped sailboat had equaled the sales proceeds from just 400 kilograms of fish. The motorized Leviathan of the 1980s was worth 5,400 kilograms of fish. The most glaring contrast, however, was between the owner's share of the annual catch and the ordinary fisherman's. 6,750 kilograms for the owner and 500 kilograms for the fisherman, compared with 800 and 600 respectively in 1965. Arambepe's history between 1973 and 1980 was the local version of a generalized and concurrent Brazilian development. People lucky enough to have been prosperous when the economic miracle became its prime beneficiaries. In Arambepe, as throughout Brazil, the poorest people, after a few years of increasing real incomes, found themselves in many ways worse off than in 1968. By 1980, Arambepe's ordinary fishermen were getting to sell fewer fish than they had sold in 1965, 500 versus 600 kilograms, while the owner's share had increased eightfold. No wonder Arambeperos were leaving fishing to outsiders. No wonder people who used to deny wealth differences now carried purses and called each other millionaires. Things could get worse, not just for Arambepe's poor, but for its nouveau riches. If chemical pollution continued to threaten fish supplies, fishermen said Arambepe's old spots had fewer fish than they used to. The harvest of the horse-eyed bonito, which usually accounted for half the annual catch, had been below normal in 1980. Fishermen contended that the more distant banks produced larger catches than their traditional territory had. An increase in annual fleet production from 108 kilograms in 1965 to 108,000 kilograms in 1965 to 130,000 bore them out. Some fishermen blamed Tivas for declining fishing productivity. In a heated argument with a skilled painter who worked for Tivas, one captain owner contended that Tivas was destroying local fishing. He had seen dead fish, and he knew that pollution had driven fish from their homes. The Tivas worker retorted by citing an observation made by other fishermen. Mackerels now congregated near the end of Tivas pipes, where they apparently feasted on the waste. "Isn't mackerel fishing better than ever?" he asked. Others told of yellow, sulfur-covered turtles and red sharks that seemed also to enjoy their seafood with sulfur spicing.